I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to Contemplating Culture.
Hello, everyone.
So today we are still within a section of Charles Taylor's book that is looking at the 19th century, he calls it, but his 19th century kind of continues until World War II. So it's he's a bit lenient, gives an extra 40-something years to it.
Yeah, definitely I'd call it early 20th century by the looking at where we're up to, but we'll let him have his 19th century.
He kind of, marks the end of World War II as this new century beginning, at least in culture, if not in time. So that's what we're tracking today, I guess, is pre-World War I, World War I, the period in between, and what we kind of, so we'll be ending, I guess, with World War II, and then we're much, from our next episode onwards, we'll be much more closer to home, I guess, in a world that's a bit more familiar to us. So today we're talking about some of the things, I guess, that were really key in getting us to where we are now. And I didn't really realize until we were looking at this, like how recent some of these things were in taking root in widespread society. So yeah, it's very fascinating, I think. So a little bit of history, and then we will look at, I guess, how that applies to us today as well, and how, they always say history repeats. It's something like that of, like the lessons we learn along the way here, I think can help us now today. So in our last episode, we were talking about, I guess, that culture or that mindset that was forming really expressed explicitly in the English school system of these, like rugby guys or rowing guys that would have an ethic of duty, that have a pursuit of heroism and, focus on production, increasing wealth, like get a good education, be a good hero, contribute to society, operate within law and order, be very malleable for your country. And understandably, there was a few reactions to that. And what we see then is a couple of new spaces for unbelief start to form. So as a reaction to that very British mindset, we're still following the British case at this point, there's going to be some places of unbelief that open up.
I mean, I think generally what happens in any collective mindset like this is people start noticing the inadequacies, the places where this falls short. So the least radical response, I guess, to this British patriotic public school mindset were people who were very conscious of the inadequacies of this space, inadequacies around lacking a depth in particular. So people who were conscious of the inadequacy but didn't really want to reject the whole picture. They wanted the sense of order. They wanted the sense of belonging. They wanted the moral code of decency. And they wanted the results of the production. They wanted, to get rich and be stable economically and all of these things. So this least radical movement, some of the names you might recognize are people like Matthew Arnold or John Stuart Mill, for instance. And they sought to, if you like, keep what had been, but to supplement it with what they might have named as higher or cultural dimensions. And for, say, Arnold, that was culture, adding culture to the picture as something that gave depth and further meaning to life for people. Others, nature, others, literature or the arts. But adding these things into the picture filled the space that faith and religion and belief had filled, and enabled people to explore profundity, explore depth in life, but not take up what seemed to be the invalidities of religion, that, faith had been discredited and they weren't going back to that. So they needed something to replace it.
Yeah. And we've talked about it before, haven't we, of when you take out the transcendent, there's a massive gap. And so you're looking for things that kind of connect you with something beyond yourself. You're looking for things placing meaning and purpose in. And as you're talking, I kind of had this image in my mind of like a highway, and they're like, okay, let's add some more lanes. Like we need to, we'll keep the basis of this network, but let's add maybe a couple extra roads, check out some new things, but they're keeping the fundamentals. They've done away with religion, but how can we use what we have and supplement it with, so more ways can kind of open up?
Yeah.
So I guess the next way, if that's keeping the structure, the next way you would say is does away with it, a little bit more radical. And it's particularly taking, I think you've said it in a previous podcast, Kat, of beauty will save the world. It was that kind of sense of just pursuing beauty as the saving hope. And in this strain of response, it's kind of like opting out of society quietly. I'm sure there's a word for it that the young people use when you just drop out of a chat without saying anything. But it's where they kind of just drop out of society, and I'll make my own little space over here where I find meaning and fulfillment. I don't really need to make any decisions because none of it is really related to anything else. It's just my little sphere. I might go off and become an artist. I might become a poet, a writer, something like that. But I'm happy in my little bubble over here, and I'm going to bring beauty into the world, and that's what's going to be kind of the savior.
So the other kind of direction that people took in terms of spaces for unbelief actually has a name, and it's the Bloomsbury set, or the Bloomsbury group. And it sits in between these, I think, in terms of that in some ways it's less radical, and in some ways it's more radical than both these others that we've mentioned. And it doesn't sit in between as a neat compromise of both of them. It just, like, in some ways, the people that made this up, they're writers, they're intellectuals, they're artists. They haven't stepped out of the world, but they have created their own world. Like, one of the famous names on this list is John Maynard Keynes. Like, he's a very well-known economist. And then you've got writers like Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster. This set are known for their modernist ideas, their liberal attitudes towards life and sexuality, their influence on literature, art, and social thought. But they're actually, like, they've got a very radical set of beliefs and thinking that sit at the heart of the well-known things that they did, if you like. And it comes out of a very simple belief that the only intrinsically good things are personal relations and beautiful states of mind. So you can only trust friendship and honest, strong feelings. So art and the aesthetic experience of beauty and that kind of thing is important, but it's important because it's a source of those good, strong, honest feelings. And everything else in the world is to be judged by how much it promotes or obstructs these intrinsic goods of strong personal relationships and strong, honest feelings. So they mostly see as valuable most of the ethic of decency, the structure of law and freedom, and many of the disciplines and much of the institutional freedom around this whole British patriotic thing within which they're existing. But they only subscribe to it to the degree that it promotes this whole thing of friendship and beautiful states of mind. They were quite critical of, they sidelined religion. They're quite critical of and just didn't subscribe to the understood sexual ethic of the time. They were quite known for their liberal attitudes towards sex, and that was probably the thing that hit the headlines the most about them, perhaps, apart from the works of art or that sort of thing that they did. They were also very against patriotism. They just weren't into patriotism at all. They were very internationalist in how they saw the world.
We see this, like in some of them are artists, right? So some of them are bringing in foreign art into England, where England was very patriotic and, wanted to promote English artists. But just as you were saying there, so they're called the Bloomsbury Group because they're living in and around a place called Bloomsbury, funnily enough. And they're meeting together, these intellectuals, these artists, these economists. And as you were saying, that sexual experimentation is just an overflow almost of their intellectual experimentation, where they're open to different cultures and experimenting in whatever their specific field was. And one of the things that's really key to this whole movement of how they do things is this value that we hold really highly now of authenticity. I think it's one of the great legacies of this group to us in the West is the value they placed on authenticity. As you said, that all the other structures around are only valuable if they're authentically expressing what's happening for me and my sense of intellect, my sense of the senses, anything like that.
So individual self-expression is very high value for them. And they really radicalized the claims of ordinary human sensual desire. They like put that up as the more important thing than the supposedly at the time higher demands of discipline and self-control, which would go with the British ethic of decency. They're like, well, actually, no, my feelings and expressing the truth of who I am is the more important value here.
And thinking about this, these are obviously, they're upper middle class, aristocratic British people. But I think you can get a sense of what it's like if you look to the generation of hippies, that it's, free love, all of that is almost an inheritance of what starts here with the Bloomsbury Group.
Yeah. And as we'll get on to this, there's a widening of this space, post-World War II, there's a movement that what had been an elite thing is more and more something that more and more people in society are subscribing to.
Yeah. So all of this is kind of happening in and around the world wars. So let's start with World War I, and how did this British ethic galvanize England leading into the war, and what was the consequence, I guess, of the outcome of that war?
Well, I guess, we've got a patriotic Britain's the best kind of outlook on life as a general society. You can see that reflected in the widespread almost enthusiasm for and hope that war would be declared, and young men rushing to sign up for the army in order to go and prove their manhood and almost prove their country, if you like. Then the reality of that war and what trench warfare looked like and the dragging on, it wasn't over by Christmas like everybody thought, it dragged on for 4 years, and the mess that it left Europe in. It really shook the whole foundations of British society and the way that they thought about themselves. It was a trauma. It damaged the whole credibility of the synthesis, if you like, that they had achieved in this British decency thing, like civilization that they thought was, their gift to the world, was supposed to protect society from this kind of war and violence through law and order. And a whole generation had seen in World War I, like the opposite of this happening. So there's a complete discrediting of all that they had held dear, if you like. And a quite generalized sense of despair and loss and cynicism.
When you're shaken up and as a society, you're not just individuals disillusioned, but as a society disillusioned, there's, ways that people responded. So Taylor says the first was to try and reconstruct this, wonderful synthesis that they'd taken into World War I, keeping decency, keeping law, but kind of doing away with that thing of patriotism and the mindless commitment to it, and opening up a bit to the rest of the world. I guess the second he says is internationalist liberalism, which is even more openness, that actually open markets, cooperative security, having international organizations rather than just keeping everything country-based was another move. And then the move to the left or the right, so to communism or fascism, which leads us into, I guess, then World War II and what happens there.
And World War II was actually, it's in a funny way, it was a bit of a resolution of some of the trauma of World War I. Like World War I really made World War II inevitable. But because of Hitler's actions, because of what people saw in the outworking of fascism and then even communism, there was this restoration of some sense to the ideal of British patriotism and to the ideal of civilization and law and order, that people had this sense of, no, this is a real thing and it's worth fighting for. And there's a real sense you can see the British people, there's a sort of a sluggish going in towards World War II, but particularly in the way that Winston Churchill picks up that sense of patriotism and that sense of we've got something worth fighting for, we've got something to give the world here. You can see that restoration of a British sense of who we are and what we have to offer. The thing is, and we've been saying this throughout this podcast, is you can't go back.
It's like once history breaks something, you can't go back to it. History's broken it. You have to make something new. You might use some of the pieces, but you can't have the same thing once history has broken it.
So this despair in the interwar years, between the wars, leading to that further retreat from belief, that widening of unbelief, it means that post-war you restore that sense of patriotism, but you're not necessarily going to be tying that synthesis of faith with it. So Taylor spends time unpacking not only the British experience of this end of the 19th, early 20th century experience, but he goes on to unpack the French experience as well. And it's actually completely different. It's an experience of a country that has had a revolution, completely changed from a quite different kind of monarchy into a full-on republic. And this republic is built on anti-religious attitudes. The church tends to tie itself to the monarchy, tends to tie itself to a vertical notion of order rather than the more modern horizontal one that the republic had. And you get a completely different set of dynamics in France because it's a completely different set of historical circumstances.
I think it's a great point that, and it's really one of Taylor's overall points of the whole book, that the history, and that's why he's telling this story, right? The history that a people has been through impacts not just where they come out politically, but all the values underlying that political stance. And so, we've traced the English, you could trace the French, you could trace the Americans, they'd all be at different points because they've experienced these events differently. Different groups have emerged and had different values emerging. And I guess one of the things that in time, I think we will be able to understand even more is that the ways we can apply this to our situations now, that this isn't just history in the past, but this is actually tools for our history that we're living now, that if we understand how the values that we hold so dearly have come about, we can make informed choices, I guess, of how important they are moving forward, or have we just inherited them? And as we're talking through, one of the things, just talking about where we might go with discussing this part of the book today, we noted that there's a comparison, coming out of World War I, we talked about a huge disillusionment, and UCAT were talking about, well, we're in disillusionment again, and possibly history is always like that. But we thought it might be good to just talk about, well, this case now, what are some of the disillusionments now, and looking at actually the same thing's happening. There's a whole bunch of responses to these disillusionments, and maybe even then what's the call for the missionary in this space, because that's what we really want to get to, in this whole process of history, how can we use the fruit of that for where we are now? I don't know if it's like this all across the world, but definitely in Australia at the moment, there's a huge housing crisis. Housing has become something used for money. It's become an economic thing as opposed to a place for someone to live. So you've got all these investment properties, and there's a whole bunch of things, and I'm sure there's a whole other podcast about the housing market and situation. There's also an ongoing, probably my whole life, at least in Australia, but beyond that, I'm sure, questions around immigration for Australia. Australia is a unique nation that had an Indigenous peoples and then was invaded by Europeans, and And then Australia was set up as a federation country in 1901. And so it's pretty new as a country. And it's, got the Indigenous people, yes, but everyone else is either a migrant or, like no one has lived here for too long generationally. And so then there's the question of like, well, who gets to come in? And we've had different policies in Australia over time, and there's different questions around policy again now of how much do we allow people to come in, but it's creating, this sense of disillusionment of like, what's the right way forward? And then, well, obviously we've moved through world wars and we know that world war's bad. So we're in a place of peace right now. Like, that's the mentality, that we should be in peace. We've learnt that war is bad. So why is Russia invading Ukraine? Why is there so much war in the Middle East? Why? And so there's this question around, I thought we were beyond this. You were saying as well, Kat, there's definitely, when we were both growing up in Australia, it was this sense that, well, we're multicultural enough now as a country that racism's kind of done, except that it's kind of not. And particularly in Sydney in recent times, we've had what's been talked about as a anti-Semitic terror attack at Bondi Beach, that it's actually, we've had neo-Nazi movements popping up. Are we really as racism free as we might have thought? And so then the questions come up of what level is their failure, and do we need to make new laws? Is that enough? How do we respond to this? And I mean, you could go endlessly for where disillusionment is, but the last one I was thinking of was just your mainstream kind of middle class Australian, and they're just disillusionment with life of, I'm so busy, I don't know, I don't have time to take stock take of where to move forward. Like I worked really hard to get through uni, then I worked really hard to get a job, then I got married, I had a family, I had kids, we're stuck in the housing crisis, but I also want to be a good person. So how do I contribute to the community? Well, I've got to make time for that. How do I look after my body? Well, now I've got to get up at 5 a.m. I'm actually a Christian, so I've got to pray. So I've got to get up at 4 a.m. before the kids get there. I've got to make sure I've got their lunches all sorted in a really healthy way so other people don't judge me. Like, just the disillusionment with like, how am I meant to survive?
And so you see, like, I was saying recently, we had Australian Catholic Youth Festival here in Melbourne where I live, and they had to completely change the direction of the pilgrimage walk in order to avoid the 3 protests that were happening in Melbourne that day. One of them was pro-immigration, one of them was anti-immigration. I have no idea what the third one was. Probably something to do with war in the Middle East, pro-Palestinian or anti-Palestinian or something. But there's this sense of like, people's response is more and more, got to find someone to blame or somewhere to channel my energy for all of this. So there's a lot of these things are tied, I think. People who are hit by the housing crisis become anti-immigration because it's the immigrants taking our jobs, or that kind of responses, which leads them into right-wing movements, which leads them more towards things like anti-Semitism or just plain racism in the world around us. There's a left-wing direction. These people are really concerned about climate change. They're, more likely to protest about that kind of thing, or pro-immigration, pro-Palestinian, Black Lives Matter. They're investing in, what has happened to our society. How come people are being so horrible to each other, or not thinking towards the future and the needs of the planet or the next generation, etc. So there's a left-wing direction that people invest into, that this is the way that we're going to fix the world, save the world. I would say too that there's I think it's called the MIDI culture, where you tap out of all of this. It's just too big. It's just too much. I'm just going to concentrate on looking after me and my family. I'm going to earn money. I'm going to pay off the house. I'm going to try and make sure we have good holidays, meaningful experiences together, and let the rest of the world sort itself out. I don't care enough.
Or I don't have the capacity to care about all of it. So I'm going to care about me and none of what's out there.
Sort of care about it. I don't have the capacity to take in all the information to make an informed decision, to decide what way my caring should go. So one of the things that Taylor's talking about in the era of history we're talking about is this Nova effect, where people are turning in different directions for unbelief. What he wants to say, and we're going to move on towards, is that in this current age, what we're seeing is in people's seeking of an authentic space for themselves, that faith is one of the places that they're looking, along with a million other things. So it's not surprising then that in this turns to the right and turns to the left and turns inward, that some of the turn is also towards the transcendent and exploration of what else is there apart from this disillusioning world around.
Yeah. And I guess our question that we always try and get to is, how do we be a missionary? What does this teach us about the world we're in and how we can be a missionary in this space? And where should we be directing people, or what should we be doing for ourselves? And I guess the first thing that I think about is there is so many people that will tell you what to do in the world. I think we need to be championing personal discernment. And you could be overwhelmed with the amount of things that you're supposed to be doing. But I think the Christian message, I think, would very much be do the thing you're called to and do it well. So discernment can't be underestimated in this space of not just discerning who am I meant to marry or what occupation I'm meant to have, but actually discernment on a whole range of levels of the things that make up your life.
I was having a conversation with one of our novices the other day, and we're talking about how something in us as human beings that conditions us to want or to think what we want is someone to tell me the things that I need to do so that I can just do them, even to the extent of in faith, give me a set of commandments to follow or whatever it is, and let me just follow them. That's much easier than the experience of continually turning back to listening to God, trying to be clear on what my individual path is and not getting mixed up by looking sideways and going, oh, but KK's doing da 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 da. Maybe that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But actually looking at, where are my gifts? What are my circumstances? What's God saying to me about how to give the gift of myself to the world, and how to live authentically as me, not tapped out of the world around me, but I can't do everything. So which things in the world around me do I invest in? And I was giving the example before of my parents moving into retirement was a good example for me of that. Like, they've both ended up in quite disparate areas in terms of where they're volunteering their time, but there's a very real sense of investment of who they are and their gifts. Mum in doing bush care kind of activities, dad in mentoring kids who've got troubled relationships at home, sort of thing. Like that, they're different, reflecting the difference of the individuals involved. But it's not a tapped out of the world existence.
Yeah, or tapped out of who they are as a person as well.
Yeah. And it's integrated. Like, they also look after my niece and nephews for my sister after school and other things like that. Like, there's a sense of they're connected to their family, they're connected to the community, they're connected to the local parish and the church. Like, some of their volunteering happens exclusively within the church, but there's plenty that happens outside of that circle as well. The sense of, I can't do everything, but here's where my personal discernment has led me to invest my energy, my gifts, my time. So that leaves us all in the individual position of where and how am I using my gifts, my energy, my time?
Yeah.
And what is God saying to me about that? So maybe we could just finish with a moment of just personal reflection. How much of what I do is influenced by the world around me and what I think other people are expecting from me.
And that's it. It's the balance between responding to the world that we live in, but from that personal relationship with God, rather than the externals.
So it's worth also taking the time to ask the question, Lord, what is it that you have for me now? Where is it that you're calling me to invest my energies, my time, my gifts now? And is that the same as what I was doing last year? And am I open to doing different things? Am I open to letting go of one thing in order to pick up something different for this time? Perhaps there's a conversation to be had with God around the lack of openness we might find in ourselves and where that's coming out of.
That's great. It's such a good spot to land, I think. It's always important wherever we're talking about stuff that rises up the sense of fear, anxiety, disillusionment, that we end in this place of hope. Because our good friend Bishop Mark will always say, you know, God made us for this time. And we should be very excited about that he thought that we had what it takes to be here now, living, proclaiming the gospel in this space. So it's great. Thanks, Kat, and thank you all those listening. And yeah, hopefully the journey is going well for you. And until next time, be well.
Amen.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.